There's real value in experiencing it at different times of year. So the house is reacting differently to the light, to the colors out in the landscape, season by season. So it's going to be a different house every time that you see it. When the light's different, or if it's raining, the house is a completely different experience. And I think people can really connect with it, even if you're not here because you're drawn to the sophistication of the architecture. Because it's so based in the fundamentals of nature, I think no matter who you are, there's going to be something about this experience that you connect with. My name's Justin Gunther. I'm the director here at Fallingwater, which is located in Mill Run, Pennsylvania, in southwestern Pennsylvania. Fallingwater was designed by the American architect Lloyd Wright, and he really sought out to revolutionize every building topology throughout the course of his career, trying to find solutions for modern living. So with Fallingwater, he kind of reinvented what we think of as a house, kind of reinvented what churches look like for America and for the world. He based all of his ideas in the fundamentals of nature. Through his architecture, tried to harmonize the built environment with the natural environment through what he called an organic architecture. So basing the design, the colors, the motifs of his buildings on nature's forms and principles. The clients for Lloyd Wright for Fallingwater were the Kaufmanns. The Kaufmann family owned Pittsburgh's largest department store. And it was a family of three: Edgar Kaufmann Sr., his wife Lillian Kaufmann, and their adult son, Edgar Kaufmann Jr. And they had known about this landscape for a long time. Originally, in the late 1800s, there was a Victorian summer camp here that was built by a group of masons out of Pittsburgh. If you know Pittsburgh in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was the Steel City, so lots of smog and pollution. So people escaped from Pittsburgh to come out to the mountains for some fresh air. So the Kaufmanns learned of the camp and started leasing it as a retreat from Pittsburgh for the employees of the department store. In the 1930s, they ended up buying the camp from the Masons and then started thinking about the idea of having a more formal retreat house here, a more formal weekend house. And at that time, Edgar Kaufmann Jr., the son, was also trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. He was in his 20s, and he really didn't want to spend his career in the family business and was much more interested in the arts. And a friend of his had recommended that he read Lloyd Wright's newly published An Autobiography, which was published in 1932. Edgar Kaufmann Jr. fell in love with this idea of organic architecture, of architecture inspired by nature, because the family loved nature and loved being in nature. So he sought out Lloyd Wright. Lloyd Wright had just established an apprenticeship program at Taliesin. Edgar Kaufmann Jr. applied to that apprenticeship program. And of course, Lloyd Wright, knowing who the Kaufmanns were, could sniff out a good potential client. So Edgar Kaufmann Jr. had no problem getting accepted into the apprenticeship program. And he spent about 6 months at Taliesin learning under Lloyd Wright. And while he was there, Mom and Dad came to visit, also kind of got enamored with Wright's ideas of organic architecture. So Lloyd Wright was chosen by the family to realize that dream of a formal weekend house here at Bear Run. So it really is the son that brings Wright into the Kaufmann universe and then starts a lifetime relationship with the architect. Wright was invited, obviously, after they decided he was going to design the house. Wright was invited to come out and visit the site. And the Kaufmanns thought that they were going to have a house that was looking at the falls. And then, of course, Wright had different ideas. He thought that if you put the most dramatic part of a landscape in your view constantly, that it would become something that's tiresome. You would just become used to it, and it wouldn't have the drama and effect of it. As if you were forced out into the landscape to see it, then it would always have an impact. So Wright envisioned this idea of putting the house over top of the waterfall rather than looking at it, so that the family was constantly living with the falls rather than just seeing it off in the distance. Because the boulder behind me that makes the hearth of the fireplace was the family's favorite sunbathing boulder and picnicking boulder by the falls, it becomes the symbolic heart of the house. The fire is always that place of gather in the heart of the home. So that boulder has a very symbolic place in the placement of the architecture, but also in the meaning of this space. And it's also the symbolic fulcrum point for the whole cantilever design. So if you think of that boulder as the center of a seesaw, all of this stone that's back here at the back of the house is holding all of the free mass that's floating over the falls, kind of pivoting symbolically on this boulder that's the heart of the home. The design work for the project started in 1935. Construction started in December of 1936, and then the family started using the main house here by the end of 1937. And then the guest house commission starts up the hill, and that's finished in 1939. So it took about 3 years to complete the project. And all the stone for the building was quarried from the site. The aggregate for the concrete came from the site. So there's that kind of physical tie to site with the actual materiality of the architecture. The house is really handmade by local laborers. So they were getting farmers and timbermen from Mill Run and Bear Run, and then basically training them on the job to build this house, which is very much, even though intensely modern, and we think of modern as machine-made, and there's certainly some machine-made elements to this house, but it's a very handmade house, which also gives it that kind of organic quality that people can really connect with. The main house here is about 10,000 square feet, half of that being exterior terrace space. And the reason there's so much exterior space is because the whole purpose of this house is to push you outside, or at least to always have the outdoors as the primary enlivener of the interior spaces. So really the internal rooms just serve as antechambers to the terraces that are outside, which is really where Wright wants you to be to enjoy nature. The siting of the house, he uses the line of the waterfall as the drafting line, and then sets his 30, 60, 90 degree triangle on that drafting line and gives the house the perfect southwestern exposure in the landscape over the falls. So it's this kind of perfect marriage of site, dramatic waterfall feature, this kind of fantasy architecture of a floating house over top of it, kind of merging into this new composition that's otherworldly and awe-inspiring. And now one cannot live without the other. The waterfall can't live without the house, and the house can't live without the waterfall. On cross axes in this room, the four elements of the universe come together and cross in the middle of this space. So on axis is Earth. You enter the house at Earth, and then you're drawn on cross axis to air out that terrace. And then on the other cross axis, fire at the hearth to the steps to the stream that go down to water. So you have the four elements converging in the middle of Fallingwater, creating this timeless experience of place. So the Kaufmann family, they also had a conservation mindset. So in addition to buying the original camp landscape, they were committed to buying additional parcels of land and conserving that land to allow the forest to regenerate. And then the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, after the land and the house were donated to the Conservancy, they continued that mission of land conservation and water conservation and grew that original donation of land to what is currently almost 5,200 acres of land that buffers Fallingwater. And the reason that that land was acquired by the Conservancy is to protect the stream that runs through the center of the entire landscape. So it's to protect that watershed. And the healthier the forest is around a stream, the better it can handle high rain incidents, severe weather. That whole mission of acquiring that land was to preserve the entire watershed of the Bear Run stream that flows underneath Fallingwater. Edgar Kaufmann Sr. and Lillian Kaufmann both die in early part of the 1950s. And then the son, Edgar Kaufmann Jr., inherited Fallingwater. and he continued to use the house as a vacation house until 1963. So at that point, Edgar Kaufmann Jr. was living in New York. He had kind of established his life in New York. He was had worked for MoMA, was head of their good design program from 1950 to 1955. And then after that, started teaching architectural history at Columbia University. But in 1963, he made the decision to donate the house and the land to the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, a land and water conservation organization, which may seem a little different for a historic house. The reason why it ended up with the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy is because of the family's love of nature, and because this house is so inspired by nature and has this intimate tie to landscape, it seemed logical to Edgar Kaufmann Jr. that it be donated to the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. He did not want this house preserved. He did not want it frozen in time. He wanted it conserved, meaning it could continue living, just like land that's conserved continues to grow and change and be part of this organic evolution of things. So by giving it to a land and water conservation organization, the house could continue to grow and change along with the landscape that was being conserved around it. He didn't want this house to be a private indulgence. He wanted it to be a public resource because he saw the value in helping people deepen their appreciation of nature through an experience of something beautiful that's built like this. And then we opened for house tours in 1964. So that means we are currently in our 60th year of being a public site. And I believe that also gives us the distinction of being the first house of the modern movement to open as a public site. So as a museum, our main mission is education. And our primary educational program here is obviously our public tour program. Outside of that public tour program, we do a great deal of outreach with local public schools and libraries throughout our region. Outside of our public tour program, we also have something called the Fallingwater Institute, which is an umbrella under which we house all of our residency-based education programming. So we have a facility on our grounds called High Meadow, where we can sleep up to 16 people for multi-day or week-long residency-based learning. So we host high school students, college students, teachers, and working professionals, where they can come here on site, immerse in the landscape, get special access to Fallingwater to learn about this place and Wright's lessons of organic architecture, and then translate those lessons in contemporary ways and in different disciplines. I invite people to explore all of that programming because regardless of what age you are or what type of learner you are, we probably have some kind of program or workshop that you might connect with. The intensity of being in the spaces is amplified because every one of your senses is engaged as part of that experience. So you're not only seeing something that's beautiful, we're hearing the sound of the falls, we're feeling the humidity against our skin, we're smelling the forest and maybe the decay of the leaves in the forest. So all of those things kind of coming together just amplifies and intensifies the experience of place, and it just kind of burns in your memory, and then also just makes it even all the more awe-inspiring.